Welcome, friends. Welcome to another edition of Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul. I'm your host, Dr. David, the Cutting Edge Doc, and here on Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul, we do in-depth interviews with individuals that are doing cutting-edge work in the areas of healing or spirituality or social transformation. I'm very excited about today's show. Today, my special guest is Alan Sieler, who's one of the world's foremost experts on the topic of ontological coaching. I know that's a mouthful, so don't worry, we'll break down what that means in a few minutes, but I'm excited to bring Alan to my tribe and for you to get a deeper understanding of what ontological coaching is and what are some of the potential benefits to you and your loved ones and to our society if ontological coaching can be adopted as a more standard practice in our world. Those of you who follow me for a long time know that I've mentioned, in terms of my personal opinion, that the field of psychology is a little bit at a plateau unless they go in a couple of directions. One is acknowledging the seamless unity of looking at psychology and physiology, and also the area of looking at psychology in the context of a deeper ground of being, which for most of recent history has been relegated to the field of spirituality. And yet, in my experience, ontology and ontological coaching gives the average person a real possibility of accessing some of these deeper levels of understanding the self in the world that historically has been relegated to a topic such as spirituality that seems inaccessible to most people. So I'm really excited about today's show. And with that, let me bring Alan Sieler into the conversation. Alan, welcome to Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul.
Thank you, David, and thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Okay, so these are in-depth interviews, so we have plenty of time. So the way I like to usually start, excuse me, is just to turn it over to you and give you a chance to introduce yourself and your work to our viewers and listeners in the context of some of my opening remarks. So let me turn it over to you for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, I agree with your opening comments, I think, about the relegation of being, and that I think it's a shame that it's not more accessible for people as part of how they can live their everyday lives. It's certainly not been part of traditional education and training. And yet I think it goes to the heart of like how we are as people, how we function, how we get on with each other, and how we can improve the way we do that. So, I mean, I've been involved with the work since 1995. I had good fortune to be introduced to it, and I looked at various other modalities. I mean, when I was a teacher for many years, working with students in schools that had so-called behavioural and learning difficulties, who I thought were very smart, and the system didn't do a very good job catering for how their brains worked. So I got interested in, or it was apparent to me that the way you related with the students and communicated with them played such a big role in their chance for succeeding at school. And so that got me interested in approaches to communication, and that ended up being all about me. So self-awareness became an issue that I thought I mightn't have to deal with, but of course it's been invaluable. And you know, amongst the modalities was neuro-linguistic programming, was various approaches to counselling. I studied hypnosis. I didn't want to be a hypnotherapist, but I could see that people who were very good at hypnotherapy were actually quite exquisite communicators, paying attention to the clients they were working with at quite a minute level. And that was all very valuable. And then when I came across ontology, I thought, wow, where did this come from? It had been such a huge, for me, it was like such a huge step forward um, from what else I'd studied, which was quite useful. And no question I got benefit from it. But when I found ontology, it was a bit like now I know what I want to do when I grow up. And I consider that I'm still growing up, still learning. There's still so much to learn.
Why don't we start at before we go further than that, so we don't lose any of our viewers and listeners, if you could just briefly define the word ontology and how you use it, and then segue into what is ontological coaching, just to provide a reference point, and then we can get back to your personal story, okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, if you go to a dictionary, you'll see in there somewhere that ontology is defined as the study of being or the study of existence. And of course, in this case, we're focusing on human beingness and human existence. And ontological coaching is coaching to way of being, which I regard as the sort of underlying driver of behaviour and communication. Way of being, I consider, is where our perceptions and attitudes live, many of which are deep-seated and out of awareness. And it's very easy, of course, to be flying blind with those and losing the possibility to be more effective in how we're living our lives, and including relating with others. Excuse me. And I think one of the distinguishing things about the ontological approach is it's put in the context of second-order learning. So that first-order learning is when we reflect back on our behaviour. So we've been involved in some situation, it either goes well or doesn't go well, and we think about our behaviour and you know what we'd want to keep for next time, or what we definitely would want to change. It didn't work so well. and that can be really useful, but it might miss the sort of deeper underlying perceptions that keep us being in ineffective habits of how we're going about life. So second order learning is about reflecting on our way of being. So what was going on with my thoughts? What was happening with me and my emotions and my moods? And what was happening in the configuration of my physiology? You know, what was my muscle tension? What was my breathing? How could that, excuse me, how could that have been affecting the way that I was perceiving the situation, the way I was thinking? Is, I think, what's a key distinguishing aspect of the ontological approach.
But a lot of people might listen to what you were saying just then, and they might say, well, that sounds like depth psychology. That's what makes I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah, that's good.
What makes ontology sort of more what makes it deeper or more radical or more essential than the realm that the psychologist would tend to deal with? Like, in my feeling, I get a lot of patients and clients and students in my practice who've had quite a bit of various forms of psychological assistance, and yet they're still stuck being what they've been being that they don't know they've been being. And so for me, there's something about ontological inquiry that goes deeper than looking at one's thinking and one's feeling. For me, it's more of a deeper level that is correlated with the things that you've mentioned. It's like correlated with what you can think and what you can feel, and and how your physiology is, and I want to draw you out a little bit because I think
Yeah, it's great.
with ontology, we're pointing to something even deeper than what the viewer or listener might have concluded from what you've just said so far.
Okay. No, thank you for doing that. Yeah. Well, my response is I think it goes into specifics that I don't think other areas seem to go into. I mean, for example, you know, we deal with specific moods that can have a huge impact on us. And moods are often, you know, invisible. They're in the background, but they're continually shaping our perceptions and behaviour. In the language area, I think there might be some similarities with some different aspects of psychology, but I think we've got a much more coherent approach about different areas of language and how they combine together, and basically how the way that you use language plays such a powerful role in the reality that you're living from. And so it's getting into those specifics that I think make the difference, and that people can see that this is immediately relevant and practical. This work comes from what I call some really heavy-duty thinkers in the 20th century who developed brilliant ideas. But the challenge is, how do you make those ideas accessible to people? And that's, to me, the question I've always got is like, ontology, so what? You know, we might think it's the best thing since sliced bread, but what can people go and do with it that'll make a difference in their lives?
I agree. I mean, I think a lot about, in that context, I think a lot about the life and the work of Martin Heidegger, where he was attempting to share about this realm of being and the power of having something to say about being. And yet, my sense of him is that he became increasingly frustrated and disillusioned in his ability to effectively communicate in a way that more than a handful of people could grasp what he was pointing at. And so I want to underscore what you're saying, that bringing the ontological realm or some facility in the ontological realm to life for people in a meaningful way that makes a difference in their everyday being in the world is no small feat.
No, it's not. And I want to give enormous credit here to what I call the founder of what we call the ontological approach now, Fernando Flores. You know, who really he engaged in a very in-depth investigation of these, you know, some of these heavy-duty thinkers, and I think started to make them quite practical. And I think there's been a succession of people, including myself, that have wanted to obviously build on what he's done and make sure we can make those links more specific. So, you know, so what's this got to do with everyday life?
I think I don't know if this was original to you or you adopted it, but I think the way of chunking down the field into these three main areas of languaging, cognition/cognition, and then moods, and then physiology, I think is a really elegant way to be able to begin to explore the material without getting completely snowed under.
Yes, yeah, and the credit goes there to the two people I initially learned from, Julio Alea and Rafael Echeverria.
Who's the second person?
Rafael, and my Spanish is not too good, Echeverria.
Okay. I'm familiar with the first person because of the Newfield Network, but I'm not familiar with the name of the second person.
Yeah. So they were colleagues for about 5 or 6 years, and that's where I first saw the the three domains, which are originally presented as a triangle, and then later came to be three circles. But the first person I'm assuming they sort of borrowed this from the biologist Alberto Maturana, paper in 1988 that he wrote. He mentioned those three areas.
Okay.
And quite interesting, Moshe Feldenkrais, completely separate to ontology, but he acknowledged those three areas as well.
You know, I work with the body quite a bit. I work with the interface of those areas. And given my ontological framework of being with people and looking and seeing, it's really remarkable how embodied, literally embodied, our ways of being and our moods and our beliefs and our expectations are. And how one of the things I've learned over working with people for over 40 years is that you can start anywhere, that all roads lead to Rome. You could start by increasing someone's awareness about their languaging. You could start with increasing their awareness about their moods. You could start with increasing their awareness about something with regard to their body posture or facial expression. And as long as you have the big picture, all roads sort of lead to Rome.
Yeah. I think what's distinctive about the ontological approach is not just the three areas, and that they're integrated, so there's a constant dynamic interplay. But if you're going to, if you're going to have change that sticks, that people are actually going to make a shift in their lives, all three areas must change.
And sometimes I think there's a spontaneous spillover.
Yes.
Sometimes there's not.
That's right.
Like, for example, a lot of times in older patients that I have that have been a certain way of being for a very long time, there are what are called histological changes. In other words, by the time the person is, say, 45 or so, they've been this way for so long that there are fairly semi-permanent changes in the body that without some intervention, it would be highly unlikely for them to change. And I see that showing up a lot in the connective tissue of the body.
Oh,
And,
fascinating.
and the connective tissue of the body can become disorganized and dried out and shortened to the point where someone can go to the gym and attempt to exercise and produce changes at the level of their muscles. But because the connective tissue is wrapped around every muscle cell and every muscle and every organ, that unless I get in there and actually make some conformational changes in the connective tissue, their capacity to embody shifts that maybe they're starting to make on other levels is really, for all practical purposes, quite limited. And it's one of the things I love about my work is the ability to sort of look at the big picture and find where the weakest link in the chain is and attempt to make some intervention there and see how much of a ripple effect I can get until I get to the next stop.
No, I think that's brilliant because the fascia plays such a significant role. I think even in our overall perceptions.
Absolutely, and also there's a tremendous amount of energy in terms of emotional trauma that is stored in the connective tissue as well, and so it can be a powerful access route to that level of mind.
Yeah. I mean, what we advocate for people that, train with us and want to develop as ontological coaches is that, you'll have some capacities for working with the body, but you're not a trained somatic practitioner, with any great degree of speciality. But what we do contend is it's your responsibility to develop a really good network of support of people with other specialties who you can refer people off to.
Oh, for sure. I mean, knowing when to make the right referral and to whom is golden. I mean, it's part of what makes, it's part of, I think, what makes an excellent mature practitioner in any field is to know what they know and to know what they don't know and to know some good people in those areas and to know when to make a powerful and timely referral.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's just one other point I'd like to mention there in terms of what can be crucial in helping people make some changes, which you may be aware of coming out of the area of biology of cognition, what's called the conserving and transforming tendencies that people, every living system has, but people have. And it's neatly expressed in a sentence that everything changes around what is to be conserved. And the idea there is we only change to the extent that we feel a certain amount of assurance and comfort that wherever we're going to in terms of being different, we're not going to significantly compromise ourselves or put ourselves at risk in some way. And so the way we approach that is to, or part of the approach is to ask people, what is it that you very deeply value about the being you have been up until now? Because your life hasn't been a total train wreck. It's got you to where you are. And to invite people to really get in touch with that and to make sure that, and often we're doing like a physical gesture, asking them to go and sort of take hold of that from themselves and bring it into a potentially different way of being in the body and integrate it. And that can make a very big difference for people.
But that can be very challenging for many people because you can have kind of a wish or a desire or a dream for yourself, but if you don't love yourself enough or if your image of yourself doesn't allow you to have that, it always occurs to you as out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why ontology is so important, because ontology gives the possibility and some methodologies for not taking being for granted.
Yeah.
I think that's where psychology falls short. They take being for granted, and then within the being that they take for granted, they attempt to help people to think and feel and act and speak in ways that work better for them. But what they don't recognize is that at least the box in which all of those things exist is limited by what people are being that they don't know they're being. And I think that's the limitation of psychology. And when I work with patients and students in developing the skill of deep inquiry, it takes many of my students years to have the skill and commitment level to take their inquiry deep enough to the realm of being so that they don't need me anymore. And one of the things I'm always looking for is ways to empower people so that maybe one day I'll come up with better ways of doing that, so that it doesn't take the average person I'm working with so long to be able to ask themselves the questions that I ask them.
Yeah. What you referred to when I was sort of, just broadly outlining that process is, I think if people find it difficult to do that, you've got a deeper way of being. that's potential for exploration. Because if the person, I mean, one of the questions we have as well is, do you fully and genuinely give yourself permission from now on to live from this different way of being? And what we want to hear is an unequivocal, resounding yes. But if
very
people don't,
often, for people to get to that point, they have to do a lot of, they have to really take out the honesty cards and really look at the costs and payoffs of their current way of being. And the willingness and ability to do that and to be deeply honest with what you're getting out of your current way of being, even though you say you don't want that anymore. And to honestly take a look at what your current way of being is costing you in terms of what you say you want. That can be some of the most courageous inner work that people need to do. And most people need support in doing that.
Oh, very much, yeah. And we tend to use a different language to costs and payoffs. We utilise, it just comes from Heidegger's work, the notion of concerns, and that every habit we have and everything we do, we're always taking care of something that's important to us, but pretty much that's out of awareness. So if someone's got a way of being that is continually perpetuating their ineffectiveness, and in some way they realise that, one of the questions we can ask is, how's that taking care of you? How is it serving you to be like that?
Well, let's take that and put it into a hypothetical real situation. Okay, let's say you're working with a client and one of their patterns that is getting in their way at some level is that they don't say no when it's to their benefit to say no. Okay, that's fairly common.
Yeah.
So let's keep going with where you're going, but let's use that as an example to put some mass to this.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, there's two questions based on this notion of concerns. One is like, well, how does it take care of you to not say no? And how does it not take care of you?
I get what you're saying. There's a way that I do that I'd love to get your take on. Are you familiar with the technique that Nathaniel Branden developed called sentence completion?
Oh, vaguely, but not specifically. Yeah.
So he used this technique to be able to help people to access the subconscious mind. He would give people the stem of a sentence, and he would ask the person to say the stem without pre-planning the way they would finish the sentence.
Okay.
And he would have them repeat it a few times, and hopefully they would get to some juicy stuff, and hopefully that would lead to either some realization or would lead to another sentence completion. So one of his favorite ways to get at what I think you're getting at with the question you're asking is he would do a sentence completion that would look something like this in the case of the example I suggested. There would be two of them. One of the stems he would say, have the patient say or the client say, is one of the good things about not saying no when I really want to say no might be blank. And then the second sentence he might have people do is one of the bad or scary things about saying no when I really mean no might be.
Yeah. I think it's in that territory. I'm going to sort of assess, I think the notion of concerns goes deeper than that.
Say more about that.
Yeah, because I think it's at the core of being human. And this is one of the beautiful things I think that came out of Heidegger's work. like his perspective is, his expression is, humans are constituted by care. He says that includes being carefree and careless. But everything we do is geared towards us taking care of things that matter to us. And that could be, like in the case of someone saying no, it could be what I call like a deep or a core concern, like of identity.
Well,
Who would I be? Yeah. Who would I be if I didn't say no? If I said no, would it be okay for me to have another identity? What would be the consequences of this? I think exploring all this with people
yes.
is about, to me, it's about a lot about exploration and searching for possibilities about what could open up for people.
Say more about this, because I think it's such a powerful way of looking at things. Say more about the centrality of this business about looking at things from the lens of cares and concerns, human cares and human concerns.
Yes, yeah. And if we use some more everyday language, it might be helpful. It's like concerns are is like what matters to us, what matters the most, what's most deeply important for us. And even when we engage in, let's say, perpetually ineffective behaviour, we are taking care of ourselves in some way, because we've learned to do that way, and we've made a judgment that that's what's required, that's what's best for me. But of course, we all develop habits that are ineffective. So it's a way of inviting people to go, I think, sort of fairly deep into their being around this notion of concerns.
How come, in your opinion, do so many people not take better care of what they say they care about?
Wow, yeah. Explanations are a dangerous business without any grounded evidence. So this is pure speculation. I just think we grow up. It's the whole thing about social conditioning. We learn in our families, in our communities, and even into adulthood, how we should be if we're to be regarded as an acceptable person in particular environments. Again, this is sort of one of Heidegger's expression. He says, in many ways we all live inauthentic lives, because he said we live in the mentality of the herd.
Right.
When he calls it the they self.
Right.
And so, one way we learn to take care of ourselves is actually to fit in with all the cultural requirements of the world in which we grow up. And one of it, an interpretation one person might have make is, look, if I'm to be an acceptable person and I'm going to have good connections with people, I'm someone who shouldn't say no.
There's such profound sociological and cultural implications to what you've just said, because to me it points to the importance of doing everything we can individually and collectively to increase the consciousness of the caregivers for young people, for the family unit, for defining and committing to what we mean by functional families and functional communities. There's a whole subset of depth psychology. Are you familiar with object relation theory?
Is that the subject-object theory?
It's basically the idea that that identity develops for an infant and a toddler in correlation with their caregiver, and that it points to the importance of the level of consciousness and the level of care of the caregiver.
Yeah.
Because literally the identity, at the ego level, at the level of the human constructed identity, it's the identity of the infant and toddler is literally forming in correlation with the consciousness of the caregiver.
Mm, mm.
And some of that consciousness is unconsciously introjected and adopted.
Yep.
Some of
Yeah.
it is unconsciously rebelled against, but it's in reaction to. And so your comments there about your answer to my question about why so many people don't seem to act in a way where they're really caring about what they say they care about, it really does go to these fundamental issues of identity and self-esteem that you're pointing at,
Yeah.
and how important it is as a society to really take seriously the study of this area and the thinking in this area and the training of people that are going to be around young people.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. I mean, people, youngsters growing up are amazingly flexible. And of course, there can be early learnings that are enormously beneficial and some not so. I think when we we talk about people in adulthood living out of, formed habits that they didn't realize they took on, that are continually getting in their way. This is where I think the notion of the plasticity of the nervous system is so important, that everybody has the capacity to change. All learning and change happens in the nervous system. And I think the job, I think, of an ontological coach is to be as sort of respectful and skillful as possible at finding a way. The term that's used by Maturana is perturb, which is like a respectful shaking up of somebody's system, through which the person might make some changes in themselves. Because the nervous system doesn't have direct contact with the world around. So a coach or a therapist cannot directly change anybody.
Right.
They have to change themselves. But the skillful practitioners, I think, are very good at, searching for the key, the clues as to what's going to give some leverage that might help someone develop a powerful new insight from which they could start to make a shift in themselves.
I agree. Are you familiar with the discoveries that have been made in neuroscience over the last 20 years about memory reconsolidation and the application of those scientific findings to helping people to make deep change?
No, I'm not. No.
So there's a therapist in the United States named Bruce Ecker, Ecker, and he and his wife have done some amazing work, and they've written a couple of books. The last book they wrote that you might be interested in is called Unlocking the Emotional Brain.
Oh, okay.
And what they did was they were doing some of this work in their effective work with people to begin with, but they didn't know why it worked. And then they came across the work that the neurophysiologists have done in memory reconsolidation to discover what are the conditions that are necessary that allow the nervous system to repattern itself spontaneously without needing to be reconditioned.
Yeah. Yep.
And what they discovered was that when their therapy work was transformational, they were unconsciously meeting many of those conditions. But
Oh, wow.
now that they knew what the conditions were, they could do it more masterfully, and they could teach other people. And
Yeah.
and when I study Ecker's work, it really has um, it really has an ontological ground to it, even though he doesn't talk about it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and he takes the point of view that your persistent problems that you have that are, um, he's not saying like if you have cancer or diabetes, but
No.
the
Yeah.
kinds of issues that would be dealt with in an ontological or psychological realm, that they take the point of view that if you have a persistent condition that you say is unwanted, that there must be some part of you that is it's meeting some need.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's in some obtuse way you're attempting to care for yourself,
Yes.
even
Yeah.
though it might be killing you.
Mm.
And so rather than fight against that part of you, and rather than the therapist trying to argue against that part of the patient, the work is designed to bring out the awareness in the client of what that could possibly be.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Um, and in other words, what have they been being in relation to that they didn't know? And
Mm.
so in that way, it has an ontological flavor.
Yeah.
Now, he's not applying his work publicly. I don't know what he's doing privately. He's
Mm.
not applying it to deeper areas of spiritual inquiry because that's not his client base.
Yeah.
But the principles are very similar. Whether
Yeah.
he could take the approaches that he's taking to the level he's working at, and he could apply it he could apply those same methodologies to fundamental questions of identity as well.
Mm. Mm.
Um,
No, that sounds fascinating.
but the neurophysiology is basically validating what we see as ontological coaches when we see a breakthrough and
Mm.
we look at the conditions that tended to foster them. It turns out that the hard science tends to validate what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, brilliant people who have intuitively hit upon things and found that it worked, and now it's being validated by different aspects of science.
So he calls his work coherence therapy,
Oh yeah. Okay.
because his view is that from a certain perspective, even the things you're doing that are not working have a certain logic,
Yes.
have
Yeah.
a certain coherence. And I reframe what he's doing by saying, I look at it ontologically. And
Mm.
I've talked to him about this. I say, when I look at your work, what you're really doing is you're really helping people to discover, in relation to a specific issue, what they've been being that they didn't know they were being.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah. It's beautiful.
So he has an institute in Oakland called the Coherence Institute, and they're doing some really good work. And
Mm.
I'd love to connect the two of you. His last name is spelled Ecker.
Yeah, I've got that. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be lovely. Thank
And of
you.
course, I'm sure you're familiar with the work from the physiological standpoint, the work that Richard Heckler is doing,
Yeah. Mm.
Jossie Heckler.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys have communicated, but he's totally committed to taking the ontological model and applying it to how people use their body and being in
Yeah.
the body.
Yeah. I think he's been doing brilliant work in that area. Um,
So it's nice to see the field starting to have some outlines of maturing.
yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, there's some. from what I'm aware of, there's some really good practitioners out there. I think a lot are working in the consulting, like organizational change space, which of course is very important.
Yeah, the thing is that it's to become an excellent ontological practitioner, you have to apply the principles to yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's, in that sense, it's kind of a spiritual discipline.
Yeah, very much. Well, it all starts, to me, it's like we're not going to be authentic if we're not continually applying this to ourselves and continuing to learn.
My spiritual teacher, my main spiritual teacher in this life has been Werner Erhard.
Oh, yeah.
One of the things that he talks about is, and I'm sure he took this from Heidegger, is that to be a real human being requires that you be authentic about your inauthenticity.
Yeah. Mm.
And that until you come to grips with your inauthenticity, there's no possibility for authenticity.
Mm. Mm.
And that has been something that rang true for me when I heard it, and 35 years later, that still rings completely true for me. That
Yeah.
there is sort of this dark night of the soul experience. It kind of brings you to your knees in some way. It humbles you to realize that this is going to sound weird, but the being that's been using you ain't so pretty.
Not always doing you favors.
Right. And
Yeah.
and to be able to confront that without sending you into a downward spiral of guilt and shame and blame and judgment, I think,
Yeah.
is one of the areas where an ontological coach can really help people, because
Yeah.
that's a very delicate time on people's path.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really important for a coach to, I think this is a term out of counseling, like normalize the situation. What I'll say to people is, look, we're just a fellow traveller in life, like the
Yes.
clients we work with. We've got our own struggles and issues and breakdowns, and we haven't got all our stuff together. And I think just to briefly share that with someone can be very helpful for them. Because often, they put the coach or the psychologist or whatever up on a bit of a pedestal.
Yeah.
And I think that could make it harder for themselves.
Another guy I'd like to connect you with, if you're not familiar with him, is, do you know a guy in Colorado in the United States named Bob Dunham?
Yes. Oh, well, I haven't actually met Bob, but we've sort of corresponded every now and then.
So Bob has an Institute for Generative Leadership.
Yes.
And he's also co-authored a book that is amazing called The Innovator's Way.
Yeah, I've got that, yeah.
And so his interest is in applying ontological principles in the area of leadership.
Yeah.
And that's an area that I think is, to me at least, is very exciting, and I think provides a way of looking at leadership as an action.
Yeah.
That is very exciting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think he's made a distinctively brilliant contribution to the leadership field. My kind of the essence of my take on an ontological approach to leadership is leaders can only lead from their way of being, and so that's at the heart of them continuing to improve as a leader. And they can only get their work done through others, which means interacting and communicating effectively with them. And the only place they can do that from is their way of being.
And I think the whole way of looking at things we talked about earlier with regard to cares and concerns has real application with regard to what leaders do. Because if someone's going to follow a leader, they have to believe that that following that leader is going to help them address their cares and concerns.
Very much.
And
Yeah.
so it's useful for a leader, if the leader wants to have followers, to think in those terms and to be, this is going to sound weird, but to be in those terms.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think the viewer and the listener from this conversation, obviously we've been kind of like a couple of jazz musicians here, just kind of riffing, but that's okay. I think I wanted people to get a taste of what ontology is and what ontological coaching is and what the possibilities could be there for themselves and for others. I'm a little cognizant of the time and don't want this to go too long, but I do want to give you a chance to say anything else that you'd like to say, and also to give you a chance to let the viewers and listeners know if they want to connect more fully with what you're doing with, I don't know if you're doing any individual coaching work these days, but I know your institute is doing teaching work, and you have a series of 4 books that are very comprehensive in covering the field. And so as we move toward the last, say, 5 or 10 minutes of our time together today, I just want to give you a chance to say anything that you would like to say to the viewers and the listeners.
Well, I think I keep reviewing this because sometimes I think, am I getting a bit carried away with my enthusiasm about ontology? Have a bit of reality check, because you can believe your own press a bit too much at times. But I think I keep coming back to being convinced this is a very different approach to, I think, a lot of what else is available to people. And it amazes me that it doesn't seem to be more widely known. Because every time I've worked with someone, and I've been doing this for 25 years now, people say things like, this is not rocket science, but it makes so much sense. What did one woman say? She said, this makes the intuitive obvious.
Yes.
And I think the beauty of it is that everything in ontology is what we already do. But the chances are, we're quite unaware of a lot of the aspects that have been identified as what constitutes being a human being. And if this could be more widely available at a basic level to people, and they could get support in application, it would be fantastic. And that might be, I don't know, a series of online courses initially, because it's hard for people to travel and pay money for conference expenses and everything. I don't know how many people have said to me, why haven't we got this in our school system?
Well, that's another long conversation.
Yeah.
Very long conversation.
Yeah. So, part of me kind of lives in a puzzlement, and that's where I think, do I get a bit over enthusiastic? But no, I mean, I'm inspired by people when they come across this work and they connect with it, and what they do with it, it's just fantastic. And I'm not saying it's the only, a good thing that's available, but I do think it's amongst probably a handful of, I don't know, maybe 10 or so approaches that we could say is distinctively different. And what appealed to me about it right from the start is how deeply grounded it is in really solid thinking. And as I said, the ideas of some really significant thinkers in the 20th century who played a significant role, I think, in the kind of intellectual change in what was happening in the Western world. Anyhow, that was a long answer to your question.
How can people connect with you and your work?
Probably easiest through the website. Because of a commercial issue, I've got 2 websites, one for Australia and the other one's for international. So the international website is Ontological Coaching Institute. and the Australian one is Newfield Institute. There's about 60 articles and papers and case studies about different aspects of the work and applications. The availability of courses is listed on the sites. Although in the current climate, we're sort of rapidly adjusting dates, not knowing when we can get together again with people.
Can you talk briefly about your 4 books?
Yes, yeah. Well, each one obviously has a different approach. The first one, after giving sort of an overview of the ontological approach and what I think is the relevance of historical context, focuses on the specifics of the language approach of ontology. Excuse me. The second book, I create a sort of what I call a framework for understanding the importance of recognising and managing your moods and emotions, and that's Robert Keegan's work on levels of adult consciousness.
How do you spell his last name?
Kegan.
Okay.
He's it's quite a straightforward, but I think an elegant approach, and I think, you know, you're trying to kind of get the essence of what the ontological approach is about. It's wanting to facilitate people transitioning to what he calls a self-authoring mind. So rather than, he uses the word scripts, rather than living out of the scripts of the world we grew up in. So this links into Heidegger as well, like the notion of the they self and conforming to cultural expectations. Starting to continue to be a responsible citizen, but write the script of our life. So that's a sort of meta frame for ontology and sort of with moods and emotions, which is the focus of the second book, which in particular looks at specific moods, the effects they can have on us and our perception and our behaviour, and also how can we go about changing our moods and emotions, taking responsibility to shift them. And then the third book looks at the biological underpinnings of the ontological approach. So it's looking carefully at the work of Humberto Maturana and Francesca Varela in the development of what they call biology of cognition, and how does it practically link in with everyday life and with coaching. And then the second half of the third book looks at the domain of the body. So I'll give a sort of philosophical underpinning to the body, drawing on, you know, people like Feldenkrais and Ida Rolf, the Alexander technique, looking at what I call the conceptual underpinnings, and then the practicalities of coaching to the body, you know, given that people aren't going to be somatic therapists. And then the fourth book's meant to sort of be a broadening and a deepening of what's been covered in the first 3 books around the notion of professional artistry. Now, coaching's not a profession, it's an unregulated industry. But I'm arguing that ontology can make a significant contribution to moving coaching towards being a profession, and looking in detail about what are the phases a coach passes through if they're going to move towards being more professional in their approach. And part of the responsibility for that is, of course, to be able to an observer and continually working with your own way of being. And then looking at the specifics of the ontological coaching process and really breaking it down into particular aspects and applications of that in an actual coaching conversation or a series of conversations in an engagement.
That sounds fascinating. You know, when you get to a certain level beyond the recipes, you really get into the art. And I don't know how to teach art.
No.
I don't know if that can be taught.
No, I think the notion of professional artistry was developed by gentleman called Donald Schoen. He wrote a book called The Reflective Practitioner and many others. He was quite an amazing sort of practical thinker.
How do you spell his last name?
S-H-O and then the German 2 dots or umlaut, N, Donald Schoen. I mean, English we call it Sean. He, one of the things he highlighted, he said there are practitioners in all walks of life, you know, doctors and lawyers, who actually don't have any more knowledge than fellow practitioners, but seem to flow smoothly into knowing the right thing to do, you know, in the right way at the right time to deal with what are often novel circumstances. And I think with coaching, you never know what you're going to be dealing with. You never know what the issue is going to be, how profound it's going to be for people, you know, how your capability is going to be stretched.
I'd like to take a look at that book. Has it been, I don't speak German, has that been translated into English?
Oh, you know, he was an American guy. He worked, I think he worked a lot in the field of management in the university sector in America.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to look into that because I've had some frustration in my own life. As I get older, there's some things I'd like to be able to pass on. And like I said, I'm a little frustrated. I don't know how to teach. I don't know how to teach that level. I don't know how to teach art.
Yeah. Well, I forgot to mention while I was mentioning all of that. I think one of the things that I took from what he said is it's really how you create the conditions of the learning environment that will allow people to explore and stretch themselves. And some people will want to go further than others, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because some people will come out and they will be quite capable. They'll be competent.
Yeah.
But there'll be other people who might be, you know, 2 or 3 stages beyond that. So part of what I draw on in the 4th book is a model of skill acquisition. It's been developed by a Heidegger scholar called Hubert Dreyfus. Unfortunately,
he just passed away.
Yeah,
yeah, Berkeley. Yeah.
Yeah. So I you know, I was able to marry Schoen's ideas with Dreyfus's framework, and say, like, as ontological coaches, we could look at phases we could develop. And if you're going to do a coach training course, you'd want to come out as being competent.
Right.
But sometimes within the course, people are developing so well, they might begin to move beyond that. And then when they finish the course and they're such committed learners, they can move beyond that, sometimes to virtuoso.
That's great. I definitely will get your 4th book for sure. That's very exciting. So can you give again one more time the website addresses for Australia and international for people want to access your work?
Yeah. So the Ontological Coaching Institute, the website address is ontologicalcoaching.com.au, and the Newfield Institute website address is newfieldinstitute.com.au.
So if someone from the US wants to access your work, they would still use a website that ends in .au.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because they're both domain names in Australia. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So give that international web address again.
Yeah, ontologicalcoaching.com.au.
Oh, .com.au?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So is there anything else you'd like to say in closing?
No, that's all, David. Thanks very much for the conversation. It's been enthralling. Really enjoyed having the discussion with you.
Well, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. Thank you, Alan. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening or watching another edition of Freeing the Body, Freeing the Soul. Here where we do in-depth interviews with individuals that are doing cutting-edge work in the areas of healing, spirituality, and social transformation. My guest today has been Alan Sieler, one of the world's leading experts in ontological coaching. He has an institute in Australia. There are materials that can be accessed online for anyone anywhere in the world. He also is the author of 4 very comprehensive books on the field of ontology and ontological coaching. So thank you again, Alan. And with that, we'll close with love and peace. Bye for now.